Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Just a quick show of hands, because I always love to ask this question. How many of you have first-time visit, or you've been before to our programs? First-time visits? Great. Wonderful. Welcome. And to those who are coming back again, we're really glad to see you here. I'm Jennifer Mock, the Associate Director for Education and Public Programs here at the Wallach Art Gallery, and it really just warms my heart on this cold February Saturday to see such a really great turnout for today's presentation. This is the second in a series of 3 public lectures that we'll be giving this month in conjunction with our current exhibition, Waiting for Omar Galato, Contemporary Art from Algeria and its Diaspora. A show as ambitious as Waiting for Omar Galato is something that can't happen on its own, and I just want to take a minute to acknowledge the generous support of the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts and the additional funding that the Wallach Art Gallery received from the Étant Donné Contemporary Art, which is a program developed by FACE Foundation and the Cultural Services of the French Embassy in the United States. Just wanted to take a moment to salute them for helping to realize the show. The music that you've been hearing when you walked in, it's actually a playlist that was created when we asked the 25 artists that are in the exhibition to share with us the songs that they listen to. And we always like to just include that when we start our programs because I think it's a nice way for the artists to be with us here in a certain light in the lecture hall space. Waiting for Omar Galato is conceived of as a survey, and the work in the exhibition offers a diverse representation of daily life from the perspective of artists active in Algeria and its diaspora. Collectively, the works speak to a larger effort to decolonize art. And joining us today to provide a historical context and help us to unpack some more the origins and how today the Algerian War for Independence continues to resonate alongside the term decolonize and decolonization, we are going to be joined by Todd Shepard. Todd Shepard is the Arthur O. Lovejoy Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. His scholarship explores how imperialism and transnational developments shaped late 20th century France, and his studies and his teachings have also concentrated on modern European and colonial North African history, with special attention to their intersections. Todd Shepard is the author of numerous books, including Voices of Decolonization, A Brief History with Documents, and The Invention of Decolonization, The Algerian War and the Remaking of France. His most recent book is Sex, France, and Arab Men, 1962 to 1979. Voices of Decolonization has been an invaluable resource to me personally in developing programming for this exhibition. And so it's really a great honor to be able to present this talk. And I invite you now to join me in welcoming Todd Shepard. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So definitely I want to thank, obviously, the gallery, in particular Jennifer Mock and Natasha Maria Lawrence, who organized this exhibit, who curated it, and the artists. I had a chance to be here at the opening to see a couple of the artist talks, and I do hope everyone gets a chance to kind of explore that. I'm a historian. I'm a historian who was trained as a historian of France, so I identify myself in some ways as a historian of the Algerian history of France. But I have had an opportunity in the last 10 years in particular to go and spend a fair amount of time in Algeria. I went there in part to see Algerian archives, material that was produced by, in this case, primarily the National Liberation Front, during its exile, during the revolution, so-called the War of Algeria, some call it, in the 1950s and early 60s. And I've also had a chance to work with a number of artists, Algerian artists in particular, and people working in Algeria. And I've presented a fair amount in contexts where its art history has been central, notably at l'Institut National d'Histoire d'Art in Paris. So I've talked a lot about, which I grapple with in my last book, with some films that have spoken to that. But I thought today it would be more effective to really focus on questions of, well, I could broadly frame them in terms of exception versus exemplarity. And it's a basic thing that I talk to my students about. I'm trained as a historian, and I talk to students about disciplinarity and how history is a discipline, as an approach to truth, to certain types of truth, and that tries to make certain types of claims, tends to fixate on the exemplary, on the repetitive. If it happens a lot, it's probably worth paying attention to. And then there are other disciplines, philosophy or art history, where the exception, one particular object, potentially one particular object, a particular moment, has so much more potentially to tell us in going in depth, whether it's close reading, forms of analysis, than simply multiplicity. And of course, these boundaries are fluid and have hopefully and thankfully been constantly moved back and forth. But I think it's worth highlighting that to talk about Algeria, and that's what I want to do today, around Algeria's very, very exceptional history in many ways, particularly in the context of an international phenomena, which was overseas European colonialism, and another international phenomena, which was resistance and rejection of those forms of occupation and attempts to govern. Algeria, exceedingly exceptional, and yet that came, and this is part of what I want to try to map out today, came to seem exemplary. The example, the instance, the episode that we need to talk about to understand other things. And of course, you'll think about already Frantz Fanon, you'll think about the Battle of Algiers. And so part of what I want to map out is how that history worked, because it really makes things both interesting and difficult for many people connected to Algeria today. And so I think the artists in some ways speak to that. Notably around Algeria's particular connection to anti-colonialism and to the moment we call decolonization, where it oftentimes stands in for something that, as any scholar would point out, well, it doesn't really resemble. So I want to begin with two moments that are particularly associated with decolonization to help us think this through. In mid-August 1947, a ceremony took place in New Delhi, currently the capital of India. It began at 10:45 p.m. in the central hall of the Council Hall, which is now known as Parliament House, with a series of official speeches that culminated as the clock struck midnight. Unexpectedly, accompanied American witness recounted by the blast of a conch-shell trumpet. Then attendees went into the night to join well-mannered crowds who had been allowed onto the grounds as impromptu fireworks and more rambunctious celebrations spread throughout the surrounding metropolis and across the land. In early 1962, a similar ceremony occurred in Algiers, in Algeria. Here, the celebrants marched through the seaside city in the late morning sun as throngs hailed their passage, before taking to a stage in the central plaza to watch a military parade. As in New Delhi 15 years previously, the Algerian leaders who read the proclamations had fought long and hard to see this day arrive. What they announced was the end, in both cases, of long decades of European rule over a century, in both cases, over their country. What people celebrated was national independence. Between 1947 and 1962, proclamations that marked the end of direct foreign control and the establishment of independent states occurred some 50 times across the globe, in cities ranging from Jakarta, Indonesia, to Accra, Ghana. Each was the result of wide-ranging developments, struggles, and debates, which had absorbed many people locally, but also had global echoes. In some places, what we often call the transfer of power happened by mutual agreement between the colonial power and local leaders. In a few others, local politicians and elites actually had to be convinced to accept independence, or simply had it thrust upon them. In many places, mass mobilization by people in the territory, sometimes, fairly rarely, supported by protests within the colonial powers themselves, forced the hands of colonial rulers. In a number of cases, there was violence involved, sometimes shocking levels of violence. In scope, notably the numbers of people killed by forces defending the status quo, by far the largest number. In kind, with the use of spectacular forms of violence, such as the beheading, the emasculation, or evisceration of prisoners, systematic use of torture and sexual assault on those suspected of sympathy with the enemy, the indiscriminate use of devastating weapons, here again almost exclusively by colonizing powers, such as napalm, in civilian areas, or both, scope and kind. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is how these many different histories all came to seem part of one larger phenomenon. As an event, what many people came to call a tide of history. It was the cause of much concern among world leaders, and even more expectations among people across the globe. This was the era of the end of empires, the transfer of powers, the victories of liberation, Europe's retreat from the world. This is what various people termed it at the time, the triumph of the third world. At least these are, again, some of the names given. It was the culmination of decades of struggle and became a reference point for events and arguments that continue until today, really pressingly until today. So I want to focus just for a little bit on these two ceremonies in New Delhi and Algiers, so as to gain some understanding of how this era developed,
how things led to another, which is to say of how these events and the people who made them happen changed history. In 1947, it was, let's see, there's the thing, it was Jawaharlal Nehru who dominated the stage. The man who had led the Congress Party of India and one of the most prominent leaders of the movement to free India from British rule. The most well-known leader in this struggle, of course, was Mahatma Gandhi, who had catalyzed mass protests since 1919, popularized the embrace of nonviolent civil disobedience, and had come to personify the insistent rejection of British efforts to delay independence and set the stage for this ceremony. He chose to spend the day in the sprawling coastal city then called Calcutta, among poverty-stricken Muslims. This was just one sign of his dissatisfaction with how independence was to occur. Lord Mountbatten was in attendance. The British aristocrat, who as the last Viceroy of India, oversaw the end of British government on the Indian subcontinent. He did so on the basis of a law voted by the British Parliament, which mandated a quick withdrawal. One decision the Viceroy made with the claim that it was unavoidable meant that at midnight of August 15, 1947, two states were born, as British India disappeared, Pakistan and India. This division, which separated off the large Muslim majority areas in the west and east from the rest, was the explicit reason why Gandhi was not part of these ceremonies in New Delhi. Still, at midnight, the world focused on New Delhi, rather than Karachi, and focused on a speech that Nehru gave. And this is what absorbed international audiences, as he gave voice, both to stirring expectations for the future and of long-standing hopes finally realized. In Algeria, many of the men who had marched triumphantly through the streets had not seen their homeland for years. The organization they helped lead, the National Liberation Front of Algeria, known by its French initials FLN, Front de Libération Nationale, had waged violent war against French rule since it announced itself in 1954. These leaders and many of their troops had been based abroad, first in Egypt, the leaders, later in Tunisia, or held in French prisons for key elements of them. Victory had come when in early 1962, the French had been forced to agree to hold separate independence, one in Algeria, one in France, to approve an agreement both sides had signed onto. After the overwhelming yes vote for independence in Algeria on July 1st, there had been an earlier one on April 8th, and in France it had also been quite massive. French authorities pronounced the end of their sovereignty in Algeria and their recognition of Algerian independence the next day, on July 2nd. FLN leaders, however, and note the difference with New Delhi, wanted to make clear that it was they, not the colonizers, who declared independence. After an internal discussion about the problematic symbolism of July 4th, 1962, they decided to proclaim the establishment of an independent Algeria on July 5th, 1962. The date was not just different from the birthday of the United States, it marked the 132nd anniversary of the treaty that had ceded sovereignty of Algiers to the King of France, whose forces had invaded. Other members of the leadership still argued that their comrades had been too accommodating to French requirements, and they stayed with troops on Algeria's border. Oops, sorry, I've done something. Surely it's just as simple as this.
Bear with us, folks. Technician. Sorry.
Well, so I'm just going to continue because it doesn't really need, this is India, it's not what I'm talking about. Other members of the leadership that had been key to the leadership of the FLN still argued that their comrades had been too accommodating to French requirements, and they stayed with troops on Algeria's Moroccan border. There we go. Okay, so briefly, you can see this is a map of Algeria. The Mediterranean is there in the north. This is Algeria as it existed at the time on maps. You can see that the green lines are their borders, but they also reflect walls that the French army had put up on each side of the border to try to prevent FLN troops from moving back and forth, ALN troops in this case, from moving back and forth between their bases, which they'd established in supportive countries, Tunisia and Algeria, Tunisia and Morocco, into back and forth in Algeria. This plays a key role in the military history of the battle. But what's particularly important here is that a number of the leaders, and I'll talk about them explicitly, had moved to or remained on the Moroccan border with troops on the Moroccan border and had not joined the returning leaders of the GPRA, the provisional government of the Algerian Republic in Algiers, who'd arrived the previous day on the 3rd of July. So that it should work. All right, cool. Okay. French Algeria, unlike British Algeria, became independent as one country. Still, independence there also sparked vigorous divisions among those who had fought for it. With this in mind, the recently named president of the provisional government of the Algerian Republic, Ben Youssef Ben Khedda, was less poetic than Nehru during the radio broadcast that he used to declare independence. He warned that, quote, those who menace the necessary national cohesion and unity must be denounced or brought to see reason, end quote. And he called on his fellow citizens to end their celebrations, quote, tomorrow. All national activity must begin again under normal conditions. And so here what we see, this is from slightly earlier, this is right after the Evian Accords had been announced. This is in Morocco itself, and it's after the release of Ahmed Ben Bella. Ahmed Ben Bella, who we see on the left of these three figures here. In the middle is King Hassan II of Morocco, and then Ben Khedda, Youssef Ben Khedda, who's at this point the head of the provisional government of the Algerian Republic. Subsequent to this, Ben Bella, actually there's a Tripoli Congress where most leaders found themselves in Libya. Ben Bella had joined Boumediene, we'll talk about him, in Morocco. Okay, so they're not, so no, these people are not here. This is an earlier moment here, but we can see then, let me just move back to an earlier, where did my little thing go? Oh yeah. Does this work at all? Maybe did these work? Oh yeah. So here, like this again is the speech that Ben Khedda gave on Independence Day itself. These two moments then, New Delhi in August 15, 1947, Algiers, July 5, 1962, had much in common. Both had been ardently sought by people in political movements who rejected European claims that ultimate decisions about how to govern their country were best made in London or Paris. Many other people had done all they could to avoid independence, primarily those proud to be associated with Britain or France. And these, it must be said, included some families whose presence on the Indian subcontinent or in Algeria preceded the invasion or occupation of their country. It wasn't just people with ties to Great Britain or to France or to Europe. Those who won independence presented themselves as heirs to a long history of struggle. In India, the Indian National Congress was proud of its status as the oldest political movement established in a colony by colonized people and dedicated to challenging the exercise of colonial power. Okay, so when it was founded at this point in the late 19th century, it was not yet for independence. That would have to wait till after World War I. Okay. The Algerians directly thought of themselves and raised the flag that they associated with the struggle of Emir Abdelkader, who shortly after the French invasion and occupation of Algiers and other parts of what is now Algeria in the 1830s, had rallied people across the land to reject foreign rule. Independence, in both cases, India, we could talk about Pakistan, but I haven't, India and Algeria, meant that the international community welcomed a new member, legally equal to other independent states in the eyes of international law. The new leaders of both states also sought to use the glow of their victory and the lessons they had learned in winning it to play an important role on the world stage. Each notably took leading roles in efforts to organize states that sought, in the context of the Cold War, to hew a course independent of either the United States or the Soviet Union. So key members of what became the non-aligned movement, for example. There were also stark differences between these two moments, between these two movements. All right, great. Which the ceremonies described above nicely mirror. Nonviolent civil disobedience had been a key arm of the Congress campaign for liberation. Again, we know this is a tactic which protesters violate laws in order to demonstrate how they support these laws in justice, which needs to end. Congress leaders themselves had established their authority by participating in British institutions and winning many, perhaps most of the elections in which they participated that the British had authorized, the very few number that the British had authorized in India. Although leery of British efforts to retain influence, leaders of India had agreed to remain associated with the UK as a member of the new British Commonwealth. It had emerged in the 1920s, but it took on a new shape when India and Pakistan decided to join it. Most also accepted, these Indian leaders, the Congress leaders, the legal process by which the British Crown transferred sovereignty to representatives of India, who themselves had won election under colonial-era system, these representatives that the British recognized. American and British dignitaries were privileged guests at the ceremony, and Nehru and others presented what they called this tryst with destiny that the people of India deserved to their unique history. They had struggled, and they were unique in the world. This was something incomparable on the world stage. The National Liberation Front, the FLN, to the contrary, had established itself in sharp opposition to previous Algerian nationalist movements, notably, for example, l'Étoile Nord-Africaine, Messali Hajj, Goudman, etc., by rejecting any recognition of French law, any French claim, as a basis of negotiation. They had embraced violent struggle as what they declared the only way to achieve victory. Whereas the French denied that there had ever been either an Algerian nation or sovereignty. The argument was there had never been recognition in international law for any government, any instance, any institution located on Algerian territory. The FLN swore to, and this is a quote from their first statement of 1st November 1954, to restore Algerian sovereignty. So they rejected, the French said there had never been such a thing. They said, we're restoring it. It existed. We have a historical argument. Their legitimacy, that of the FLN, came from their combat on the ground and on the world stage, rather than through elections or debates in French-established or French-recognized fora. Among the guests they invited to witness their triumph were young would-be revolutionaries from around the Arab and African world, such as Yasser Arafat, a leading figure among Palestinian nationalists who would later lead the Palestine Liberation Organization. Nelson Mandela, the South African leader of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the recently banned African National Congress, although invited to attend the ceremonies, preferred to leave the FLN camps, where he had received military training in Morocco, to return to lead the struggle in his homeland. And he, unfortunately, was quickly arrested. Both groups modeled their claims and tactics on the FLN. And these two are particularly important here, just in this particular historical study. Algeria's historians, such as Columbia's own Matthew Connolly, have argued in particular, was the first instance since the Treaty of Westphalia that international recognition of the exercise of sovereignty was recognized to a group, in this case the Provisional Government of the Algerian Republic, where there was no legal antecedent that the governments accepted. Nobody else recognized that there had ever been an Algerian sovereignty that had exercised its power from Algerian territory. The FLN succeeded in convincing the United Nations to recognize it. And the two most prominent groups that model themselves on that, who also have to confront claims that there was no prior sovereignty, that the imperial power had invented that sovereignty by extending their own, were successfully the African National Congress in South Africa, and so far unsuccessfully the Palestine Liberation Organization in Palestine. So they're directly modeling themselves on the FLN. And they're there. Algeria's new leaders were eager then to present their triumph then not as something unique to them, but as emblematic of a revolutionary wave, which would sweep away all vestiges of colonialism and bring what many now call the Third World to new prominence on the global stage. There are many ways we could describe what these two moments share in common. With each of them, we would need to remain aware of all the things that distinguish them. It must be said that in 1947, however, very few people in London, in Paris, in New Delhi, but also elsewhere, such as Algeria, would have predicted that Indian and Pakistani independence were precursors to Algeria's. Their people, their histories, their legal status, the durability and strength and organization of anti-colonial movements, all made them too different to draw connections. In 1962 and ever since, however, the connections have come to seem quite clear, undeniable, and to extend to colonial situations across the globe. Today, again, this phenomena is most often termed decolonization. It encompassed actors and choices of all kinds, people from all stations of life, and from around the world, but it also has some big meanings. Decolonization, that is, has subsumed other descriptions of what happened to European overseas empires after 1945. Some widely used, I've talked about national liberation, the transfer of power, the end of empires, as well as designations that we mainly find in archived documents. The British Colonial Office, for example, would talk about constitutional advances, or diarchy, or British officials in 1945-46 would talk about demission. We're abandoning our mission. Contemporary anti-colonial critics proposed numerous names as well. In the 50s, the Senegalese essayist and historian Abdoulaye Ly described what he saw happening as, quote, a ring of fire burning all along the tropics. While in 56, sorry, that's wrong. We'll get to him in a second. In 56, French anthropologist Georges Ballandier referred to, quote, the insurrection of poor and dominated peoples, end quote, in order to argue, quote, this is the event that defines the 20th century. It was in French that the word decolonization first began to circulate widely. French language writers regularly began to use it in reference to the Algerian Revolution between 1954 and 62, the possible independence of French sub-Saharan colonies a few years later, and the Belgian Congo, which happened in 1961. In popularizing it, they changed what it meant. But that's another story. The most important commentator, however, who really gives us some access to what people thought was happening, was the revolutionary theorist Frantz Fanon. In the articles and books he wrote while working with the National Liberation Front. A man of mixed European and African origins, Fanon had been born a French citizen on the Caribbean island of Martinique, which legally, like Algeria, was part of France. He had trained as a psychiatrist in Paris with some psychoanalytic influence. In 1953, he was named director of a hospital in Algeria, present-day Blida, at the time it was Joinville, where he had found himself when the FLN began their anti-colonial struggle. His own personal confrontation with French racism had led him to write, when he was in France, extensively on what it meant that he and others were forced to think of themselves as black, rather than simply humans, which he argued deformed all people involved in this society. After he left Algeria to join the leaders of the FLN in Tunis, he extended his harsh critique of Western racism to Western colonialism. Like earlier European writers, Fanon used the term decolonization to describe specific instances in specific territories. He usually discussed decolonizations in the plural. Unlike French officials or commentators, however, he believed that what supporters named the Algerian Revolution demonstrated that such movements were immediately necessary. They couldn't have to wait, and were the only hope for true human progress. Situating the people he described as, quote, the colonized, in the history-making role that Marxists usually assign to the proletariat or the working class, Fanon summoned what he termed, drawing on Marxist traditions, the wretched of the earth, to take action. Radical critics like Fanon claimed that struggles for decolonization could expose the violence and oppression inherent in the emergence of Europe's modern imperial nation-states. Fanon also predicted that their actions to end colonialism might announce the birth of a new era, when, quote, the last shall be first. This did not occur. Many students or scholars today employ the term decolonization to indicate merely the end of European states' formal colonial empires, whatever cause these scholars might attribute to it. This appears to be a value-free definition, and it seems to differentiate it from other terms, like national liberation, which highlights the victory of anti-colonialists, or transfer of power, which draws attention to shared decisions by leaders of the colonizers as well as the colonized. This is in part why, in the months leading up to Algerian independence, French commentators who had strongly supported keeping the country, French, making Algeria purely French, first popularized the use of the term in the singular, decolonization, rather than decolonizations, as Fanon would have it, as in, quote, decolonization was inevitable. If the decolonization of all colonies was inevitable, then Algeria's decolonization was not France's fault. It didn't reveal anything specific about what was wrong with the leadership, what was wrong with the organization, what was perhaps wrong with the principles that governed France. It also notably suggests that there wasn't much to look for in terms of those who had fought for independence. If it was inevitable, we could have just waited for it to happen. The FLN, the Algerian struggle, didn't really matter. That is to say that references when we talk about an era of decolonization, it can seem like it was simply a structural process, a tide of history, without human actors or individual decisions. But we can also think of the term decolonization differently. We can employ it, as many do today, to explore and critique the gaps between what happened, and what happened then, for many people, was limited in some ways to national independence. People like Columbia's own David Scott reference constitutional decolonizations. The gap then, what happened, independence, and what was hoped for. And what was hoped for was profound in terms of freedom and fundamental change. To understand decolonization, then, it's first necessary to realize that the term refers to something more than an era of decolonization. It also summons to mind a promise of sweeping change. When we talk about the era of decolonization, centered largely then 1945, 1947 to 1962, what's primarily at stake are questions of national independence and political sovereignty for Asians, political Pacific Islanders, Caribbeans, and African peoples. Discussions of something more, however, are particularly important. That is the promise of decolonization. And this refers to something bigger, something more abstract. And to put a finer point on it, this results in particularly in striking ways from Algeria's very unique struggle for independence. How Algeria won independence gave real flesh. This idea that decolonization, the end of imperial rule, would change the world. That is, this is what we see when we think about how this, what was seen by so many people as totally exceptional. It wasn't a colony, it was part of France. It was wholly different. It's unlike all these other places. How it comes to seem to emblematize decolonization. This promise of decolonization is something that would change the world. It took shape over the course of those years, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and it luckily continues to influence world politics and political activists. The dream that movements that fought to end European colonialism and the sacrifices of those who struggled, and so many of whom died to end colonial rule, would lead the way to worldwide liberation from unfair, from unjust, from racist conditions. The importance of both aspects, that is the era and the promise, result from how dramatic and unexpected what happened seemed to people at the time, and how many people's lives were directly affected. Like the two world wars, decolonization was a truly global phenomenon. Of course, part of what made it so different, and to so many a source of hope and inspiration, was that most of its actors, most of its most important actors, unknown as well as world-renowned, such as Fanon, came from outside the West, and were of African, Asian, or Pacific Islander descent. Decolonization took place directly after the horrors visited upon humanity by two world wars that began in Europe. The arguments of anti-colonialists drew strength from widespread and intense revulsion at the ideological claims and acts of fascist movements, notably Nazism, which celebrated the violent conquest of foreign lands and peoples and used explicitly racist arguments to justify mass murders and vicious oppression. In addition, decolonization occurred in the midst of a conflict, the Cold War, spearheaded by countries led by and run by men of European descent, the United States of America and the USSR, a conflict that seemed at once immune to public pressure and fated to lead to worldwide nuclear devastation. For all of these reasons, this movement of these that happened in different countries and absorbed so many people, even in places it didn't happen, seemed to promise that a better world was dawning, one that had learned lessons of the past about the need all peoples had, both for freedom and equality. The continued existence of dramatic economic inequality and misery alongside racism was the other form of injustice that critics frequently linked to colonial rule. There were small advances, but most people in the colonies were increasingly aware that decisions about their lives remained in the hands of outsiders, and this encouraged arguments that colonialism was responsible for difficult economic conditions. And the stark divide in terms of wealth between metropole, that is the homeland, the country that ruled, France, the Netherlands, Britain, and the colonies on the other. Discussing Algeria, the novelist Mohamed Dib's powerful novels, such as 1954's L'Incendie, presented readers with devastating depictions of how the colonial state's disregard for the basic welfare, the human existence of local people, led to famine and destruction. The French anthropologist Germaine Tillon, so she's there on the horse, in an attempt to explain how the conditions of rural Algerians, that she witnessed the difference between what she'd seen in the 1930s and when she returned in the 1950s. In terms of pauperization, people had grown poorer. Their conditions were worse. This is what had affected, this is how French rule had changed the conditions of Arab and Berber peoples in Algeria between the 1930s and the 1950s. Such intellectual arguments about unfairness help explain why, although European efforts, particularly after 1947, European governments desperately tried to prove that they were changing, they were reforming. You changed the name from the Empire to the Commonwealth, or the French Empire to the French Union. You put in place, as Fred Cooper here in New York at NYU has shown so extensively, new social welfare policies. But anti-colonial activism continued to grow because people refused to put up with it. In fact, it did more than grow, it grew more agitated. As European promises of reform seemed to push helps for independence further into the future, on-the-ground deceptions about what was resulting, about what couldn't be hoped for from them, encouraged anti-colonialists to become more radical. And this is why this particular struggle, that of Algeria, garnered enormous attention. What its instigators came to call the Algerian Revolution. Others spoke of the Algerian War. French officials, of course, perhaps you know this already, tended to soft-pedal what was happening as events in Algeria. Over the 8 bloody years of this conflict, and in part because of it, this is my claim here, the certainty that the decolonization of all colonies was inevitable became a widely shared assumption across the world. Algeria, that is, was supposed to be exceptional, wholly unlike other overseas dependencies. It wasn't a colony. In fact, the 1946 French Constitution, which ends, there's no longer an empire, and there's no longer colonies. The colonies that were colonies are now called overseas territories. Certain of them became overseas departments. According to the 1946 French Constitution, Algeria is neither of those. It's officially part of the metropole. It was always supposed to be wholly different. But how did this exceptional thing become, by 1962, widely cited as the preeminent example of why and how decolonization happened? When the FLN began its violent campaign for independence on November 1, 1954, French politicians and Western journalists almost universally responded that Algeria had nothing to do with other overseas territories, particularly those that were moving towards independence or had recently won independence. Algeria was France. This was legally the case and had been for decades. Although it was the presence of almost 1 million, they often were termed Europeans. They came to be called pieds noirs, Blackfeet, which made it seem more plausible. It was legally the case, but the reason people could believe it is because, well, they kind of looked European. These Europeans dominated economic life. They were far poorer than most people in metropolitan continental France, but they were much richer than other people in Algeria, the so-called Muslims, the Arabs and Berbers. Some families, many families of Europeans, had been there for decades, for generations. And in some towns in the biggest cities, notably Algiers and Oran, they comprised the majority of the population. The close to 8 million inhabitants of Arab and Berber backgrounds, whom French laws defined legally as Muslims, this is what the French secular laïque republic called them, Muslims, while insisting that it had nothing to do with Islam. I could explain that. And since 1944, these French Muslims were officially citizens of the French Republic. Yet only a small percentage of those in Algeria had the same legal rights as their European compatriots. Their real rights were even less. The rest had far few legal rights, and the majority lived in truly miserable conditions, pauperized, as Thion said, which had gotten worse in recent years. Like all nationalists, anti-colonialists or not, the frontists, those members of the FLN, asserted that they represented the nation and that all true Algerians shared a culture. In this case, they slightly altered that had been established in the 1930s, a kind of triptych understanding. They said it was one anchored in Berber roots, shaped by Islam and its values, united through the Arabic language and by a desire for liberty. For these reasons, this unified nation needed its own state. Independence, the FLN argued, would allow them to build new ties to their North African neighbors, the rest of the Maghreb, notably Tunisia and Morocco, as well as the Arab and Muslim worlds. Most people in France, or who spoke as French people, rejected all of these arguments. Only a handful of people in continental France were willing to entertain the idea that there was an Algerian nation, or that there ever had been a pre-existing Algerian state. Many argued, even particularly those people on the left, that the FLN's so-called nationalism was simply a combination of two things: anti-European racism and Muslim fanaticism. Some, including the center-left government that was in power, led by Mendes France, when the war broke out, agreed that France should do more to remedy the economic and social injustices. It should do more to extend new rights to Algeria's Muslims. Yet even these people insisted that only France could improve Algerians' lot, and that independence would have disastrous effects on Algerians, as well as on France, but mainly on Algerians. It would be disastrous for Algerians. Despite FLN claims that they represented the people, and that the Algerian people en masse were rising up to kick out the occupiers, many Algerians did little or nothing to support them. Many members of the European educated elite remained attached to France. A substantial number of anti-colonial Algerians did not recognize the FLN's authorities, as some looked either to the Algerian Communist Party, and more remained loyal to other nationalist organizations, notably UDMA, which were not at this point for immediate independence and certainly not through violence. So I want to just briefly pause there, because this is one of the things that makes Algeria's struggle so unique. That the leadership of the National Liberation Front, and this has been true since the late 1920s and early 1930s, when Algerian nationalism as a nationalist movement that claimed the move towards independence in particular, they came not from the elites. Certainly, in particular, not from what the French would term in the French term as évolué, the evolved. They were not people that had been raised up either through education or, in particular, through the establishment of officer status in the armed forces. So they're really different from people like Nehru and Gandhi, who both had legal degrees from British universities, from people like Chu Enlai or Mao Zedong or Ho Chi Minh. These were not people like Leopold Senghor. They came from the leadership of the FLN. There was some people, we know that Ferhat Abbas was a pharmacist who joined the FLN later, but the key leaders mostly were non-commissioned officers, if they'd been in the French armies. They were members of union organizations. They were working-class militants. The elites did not join at the beginning. So this is something that gives a particularity to Algeria's struggle that's really disconnected in certain ways, and some people have made many arguments about the lack of the role of the so-called intellectual class, or certainly the evolved elite class in this. Okay? But again, it was really difficult to get people involved. Of course, then I want to turn to the second, which is that many Algerian people in Algeria had no opinion of the FLN, or more important, were unwilling to challenge the existing government, or preferred stability to radical change. Of course, for the vast majority, they're living in abject poverty. The first reports that the French sent back after November 1st suggested that a key problem they were facing is that these French citizens, over 50%, had no access to cash of any kind, and close to 60% were living on the verge of starvation every single day. So they have all sorts of things to think about besides politics. There's a mass disconnect in terms of language, in terms of connections. So the Algerian people overall, many of them are looking elsewhere. Most of them, that is, made choices at the time based on local conditions, on personal group loyalties, on family ties. They didn't necessarily have a settled opinion of French rule or of the FLN, what it was offering. And if they did, they didn't necessarily have the means or imagine that they could make choices based on that, what they believed. The fact that Algerians were divided between Arabic and Berber language speakers, between different so-called ethnic groups, was not merely a fact, and it's arguably a fact. It, of course, had been an aspect of colonial rule. As in all overseas colonies, French governance often had worked to encourage such differences, to stoke rivalries between different groups. But such divisions did encourage people to respond in diverse ways to the war that the FLN had begun. One measure gives some indication of this division. Over the course of the war, at least according to statistics we have, the number of Algerians who served in the French armed forces, in auxiliary units such as these so-called, in auxiliary movements such as these, the so-called haki, or worked for, or as regular members of the armed forces, or who worked for the French government, the numbers of these Algerians was far greater than the quite small number of people who actively aided the FLN. Indeed, the statistics and the kind of deductions that we have suggest that less than 3% of adult male Algerians were directly involved in FLN activities. Now, it's interesting to note that roughly the same percentage, a little bit less, are the estimates of people that we have that were directly involved in the French resistance against Nazism during the war. And it's worth pointing out that far more Algerians died during the war than French people died during the war. But we can see how difficult it is to really actively engage in this fight for resistance. To win, the FLN did more than what it would later claim, depend simply on the people. But the FLN recognized that it needed to force Algerians to choose sides, to have as many people as possible recognize its authority, even if they were not actively involved. And this they succeeded at. Far more than 3%, far, far more, came to recognize their authority. And violence here was key. France had ample means, militarily and financially, to punish resistance of any kind and to reward any form of loyalty to France. The FLN argued that given French power and their record of brutality, of brutally repressing nationalist activity, and there's much recent evidence of that, notably in 1945, the FLN, had no choice but to use violence in order to create the conditions that would allow Algerians to express what they felt inside, their support for independence. The forms FLN violence took changed over time. In the first months of their action, the National Front leaders claimed that the only civilians they targeted, and they didn't have the same explanation for military or police forces, the only civilians were either traitors or direct agents of the colonial state. Their definition of traitors, it must be noted, was broad, and it included Algerians who worked with the French government, as well as, and this became more so over the course of the struggle, anti-colonial activists who rejected the FLN injunctions to join them, who rejected the FLN's authority. Its deadly combat with a rival nationalist group, the Messalistes, we could talk about this, the Algerian National Movement, the MNA, continued for years and included the killings by each of the other civilian supporters. In August 1955, certain groups of mujahideen, fighters in Arabic, whom French authors named felaga, not fighters but bandits, and later the French would term them hors-la-loi, outlaws, began to target the European civilian inhabitants of what they termed colonialist centers. This is August 55, so a few months later, they changed tactics. The strategic aim of what the FLN itself named terrorism was to encourage or force local Muslim inhabitants into a new level of complicity with the rebels. Locals became complicit if they participated, or more often, if they just remained silent. Even more frequently, French retribution convinced them that they had to align with the FLN. And this was definitely a goal of FLN violence. French violence was far greater in scope and its effects. The systematic use of torture on Algerians suspected of any form of complicity typified the French reaction to FLN acts. One of France's most widely read journalists warned as early as February 1955, 3 months after the war begins, after the events in Algeria begin, that these tactics were turning French soldiers into what he named the Gestapo. Despite such hand-wringing on the part of a few people in France, French military adopted illegal techniques with the claim that they were needed to prevent any type of violence, in particular what they came to name themselves terrorism, even if it wasn't terrorism. Archival evidence, however, clearly shows that the same techniques were not being used in response, were not being invented in response to FLN strategies. They had been in long-term use in Algeria by the French forces since the 1930s. This evidence, this is important to remember here in this country in particular, also indicates how ineffective torture was as an intelligence gathering tool. Victims were desperate to end their agony, and so they were more likely to say what they thought the torturers wanted to hear, rather than what they knew to be true. And this is one of the striking lessons that we could have taken from the Algerian War and the massive evidence we now have about how torture was both used and what its effects were on French decision-making. Okay? Just as with the army's use of collective punishment, they destroyed villages, they confiscated land in response to accusations of support for the FLN, French violence aimed to deter people from supporting the FLN and deprive the organization of the support and supplies it needed to conduct its campaigns within Algeria. Okay, so here's the type of identity controls which the French were convinced were necessary to stop the violence, but of course the immediate effect was to force Algerians to consider themselves as aligned with the nationalist cause. The French think it's true, and this is so crucial to the FLN's success in gathering additional support from people who came to see that they had no choice. They had to take a stand, even if they didn't have the resources, monetary resources, or the deep desire to do so. So it was in the name of responding to French collective punishment against Muslim civilians that in 1956, the FLN explicitly began to embrace what they named terrorism. The FLN said it would expand its strikes against outposts of the colonial state to include all European civilians. In practice, FLN forces killed far more Muslim civilians. The estimates are around 16,000 than so-called Europeans. Critics, however, particularly in France, and they spread these images around the world, focused on the type rather than the scope of FLN violence. The French government and other supporters of French Algeria produced endless photographs and testimonials about the FLN's supposed savagery, its terrorism. French and international media fixated on incidents where guerrillas had emasculated, castrated, or beheaded soldiers or civilians. International and French condemnations of FLN violence reached their height in 1957, around the FLN's massacre of the villagers of Malouza. These were accused of being associated with this MNA, the other big group that was fighting for independence in Algeria at the time. The mainstream French press presented the anti-colonial barbarism as far more despicable than French army activities, such as napalming villages, collective punishment, or even torture. The almost complete absence of images of such state-sponsored acts certainly facilitated this wartime focus on nationalist atrocities. And it's worth pointing out that the FLN itself had actually made a decision not to spread images of torture. They did this to maintain what they called their people's dignity. So the MNA made a different choice. So there were images that were spread by anti-colonialist groups, notably in France, of scenes of torture, of people that had suffered from torture, been killed by the French, but the FLN explicitly tried to restrict these images. It was part of their understanding of what needed to be built in their struggle for independence. By the war's end in 1962, an estimated 3,000 European civilians had been killed by the FLN. So 3,000, again I said 16,000 estimates for Muslim civilians. There were nearly 18,000 French soldiers who'd been killed by FLN's forces. The number of Algerian dead are far more uncertain. Estimates from the independent Algerian government would reach up to 1 million. More recent demographers working with archivally based historians point to at least 350,000 Algerian dead as a result of the war. And that argument suggests, or these scholars suggest, that about 250,000 of these Algerians died directly from French violence, with famine and disease leading to the death of 100,000 others. So again, one of the things that's classic in this moment is we have really detailed and specific numbers for European dead and just enormously large evidence and enormously large estimates about the number of people killed on the ground by European forces and their allies. Debates about torture and terrorism played an important role in making the war a topic of international debate. And this internationalization of the combat, of the struggle, was something that the FLN had made a key goal, and that the French government sought every means to avoid. They did not want people talking about this elsewhere in the world. Early on, the French had had some success. Since both the Soviets and the United States saw France as a crucial player in the Cold War, neither contested French arguments that Algerian events were domestic. This was something that was about France. So both sides let them get off scot-free for the first couple years. Ongoing violence, however, and in particular the success of FLN outreach campaigns across the world, in the United States, in South America, quickly changed this dynamic. When the Bandung Conference in 1955 made Algerian independence a central topic of concern, despite the efforts of US allies to avoid this, and the French too, it aided FLN efforts to present Algeria's independence as a moral imperative. And it was not necessarily, they claimed, anti-Western or even communist. Simply, it was right. This needed to happen. This made French efforts to focus attention on violent terrorism more and more ineffective, and critics within France of government violence more influential. Again, this is particularly visible in the well-known Battle of Algiers, which began with FLN terrorist attacks in the cities in late '56, again after their announced move towards terrorism, and ended after French forces crushed the last cell of FLN fighters in late '57. This French victory, which owed much to torture and intimidation, turned out to be a public relations debacle. And of course, the film The Battle of Algiers, which came out in 1966, magnificently captures the nuances and drama of this episode. And it was one of many such moments throughout the war. In 1956, again, this is the famous, or the infamous, here, this is an image from the film that again captures a whole bunch of different things that are happening here. In 1956 as well, French anger at the assistance the Egyptian government gave to the FLN. And this was not just material support, but in particular moral support through the Voice of the Arabs radio station, which had a lot of effect within Algeria itself. This contributed to the French government's decision to join the British and Israeli governments and their armed forces to attack Egypt and to liberate, as they called it, the recently nationalized Suez Canal. They had initial success, but no one on the international stage accepted the Europeans' pretensions that they had intervened to help the Israelis after the invasion happened. It was clear that there had been a premeditated plan to humiliate the leader of Egypt, Colonel Nasser, and revolutionary Egypt, and to reaffirm French and British power in the Mediterranean. So when not just the Soviets, but the United States, when President Eisenhower demanded that the American allies, all of them, Israel, Britain, France, withdraw without conditions, the British quickly agreed, and this then led the French to do the same. Rather than reinforce their authority, Suez seemed to prove that neither France nor the UK had the capacity to act in the world without America. In 1958, another set of dramatic events in Algeria precipitated what many termed a coup d'etat, and this forced the existing government out of power. This was started in Algiers. Here's images here. A new government led by the famed World War II hero of France, Charles de Gaulle, established a new constitution, the Fifth Republic. So again, the Algerian War, Algerian efforts, the actions of Algerians fighting for independence dramatically changed the terms of how people were living within Europe itself, within France. At this point, de Gaulle said, we're going to fully integrate, make Algeria totally part of France, we're going to extend equality, we're going to make massive investments. They got initial support. The British, but most importantly, the Soviets and the Americans were for them too. The FLN saw this as a giant threat, but quickly it recovered its footing. Not militarily. The FLN would never really fully challenge the French on the ground in Algeria, notably after those walls were put up that I began with, but on the international stage. It became increasingly clear from across the world that the French arguments that Algeria was part of France no longer made sense. And it's here that when Algeria's independence finally became accepted by French leaders in 1961, 1962 most clearly, they did so not in an attempt to explain what they'd done wrong, but simply that it was inevitable. There was no option. Decolonization was an international phenomenon. There was nothing you could do. From 1945 to 1962, then, the idea that countries would become independent seemed like something you could debate. It seemed like it was something that was specific. You needed a Nehru, you needed a Gandhi, you needed the Indian National Congress, you needed something deep and long, you needed educated people that Europeans approved of to take over. And we could fight and debate about it. By 1962, thanks to Algeria's independence, it came to seem inevitable. There was nothing to be done. You needed to end colonialism. That is to say, this then would inspire many, many people across the globe. 1966, the Battle of Algiers is one indication of it. Last year, there were all sorts of events, and some of them are still continuing. For example, in El Paris right now, there's a Zeneb Sedira exhibit on the Pan-African Festival of 1969. You should see William Klein's movie of the time, but it reminds us of how across the 1960s, people from across the world looked to this as a space of victory. Algeria had shown the world that something different from the Soviet model of revolution could affect political change. Martin Luther King referred to it. People fighting for gay liberation in France in the early 1970s referred to it. People fighting for Basque rights, the Basque movement, changed from a right-wing nationalist movement to an explicitly left-wing anti-colonial movement in 1962, in 1963. They looked to this struggle then as an inspirational model for how to change. The most radical moments, the most radical aspects of it, inspired groups such as the Provisional Irish Republican Army that emerged in 1969, and in this country, particularly well known, the Black Panthers, who embraced a concept of internal colonialism to explain what the United States was subjecting them to. So we have this enormous moment of inspiration tied to a very particular struggle. All sorts of optics and explanations of why it matters, why it should inspire the world, why it stands for the idea that the last should be first, that true justice is possible, in all the real limitations and specificities of an actual movement that was starkly divided. That in 1962, then, if we think back to those first pictures, saw not just a disagreement between Yusuf Ben Khedda and Ben Bella about who should rule, but eventually a direct conflict that was barely averted in terms of military war, but still led to the expulsion of those who stuck with Ben Khedda, who had marched into Algiers in the early days of July, and instead to the taking of power by Ben Bella and Boumediene, his key military ally, who'd stayed on the borders. Of course, in 1965, at the very moment that the Battle of Algiers was being filmed on the streets of Algiers, with all sorts of tanks there to serve as props for the film, I hope you've seen the film, Boumediene led a coup d'etat to throw out Ben Bella, just as he summoned back army officials who were not acquis, but had stayed with and fought with the French armed forces against Algeria's independence, despite the fact that they too were Algerians, to come in and professionalize the army. So a very specific set of struggles that yet fits into and seems to resonate with much bigger things. And I think that's part of what the artists and stories that we're seeing about Algeria today help us think with and force, and that they, people from and linked to Algeria, necessarily have to encounter and grapple with. Thanks a lot.